When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, few in the German High Command regarded the new opponent as a serious battlefield threat. The Wehrmacht had already overrun Western Europe, shattered Soviet defenses in its initial advance, and demonstrated a level of tactical cohesion unmatched in modern warfare. American forces, by contrast, were viewed as inexperienced, lightly tested, and lacking the hardened aggression that had become synonymous with German arms. Much of this perception came from interwar U.S. doctrine. The American military had not fought a large-scale conflict since 1918. Many of its officers were peacetime professionals accustomed to limited budgets and small maneuvers. The U.S. Army of 1941 lacked the combat exposure, the mechanized culture, and the ruthless pace that characterized the Wehrmacht. German officers studying American training films often concluded that U.S. troops would be methodical but hesitant, more mechanical than instinctive, more procedural than fierce. By early 1943, the Germans believed these assumptions were confirmed. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February revealed serious flaws within the U.S. Army. American units broke under pressure, armor moved without infantry coordination, and artillery responses lagged behind rapidly shifting German attacks. For the seasoned veterans of the Africa Corps, particularly those under General Erwin Rommel, the engagement reinforced the idea that American soldiers could be overwhelmed through shock, speed, and aggressive maneuver. Yet beneath these early failures lay a factor German commanders underestimated: the American capacity to learn. In the weeks after Kasserine, U.S. forces underwent a transformation that would ripple across the remainder of the war. Training became harsher, discipline tightened, doctrine evolved. Officers who hesitated were replaced, and a new ethos emerged, one built on adaptability, initiative, and the willingness to push forward even under punishing conditions. American units began treating each engagement as a classroom, cataloging their mistakes and turning them into rapid improvements. By the time the Tunisia campaign neared its end in May 1943, German frontline reports contained subtle but significant changes in tone. Patrol clashes were no longer one-sided. American counterattacks grew more coordinated. Their infantry displayed a sharpness absent only weeks earlier. German commanders who once dismissed U.S. aggression now noted an unsettling shift. The Americans were not simply improving, they were developing an edge, a willingness to push attacks with renewed force even when conditions were unfavorable. This growing ferocity revealed itself again during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. American units advancing through rugged terrain demonstrated an intensity that challenged German defensive assumptions. At places like Troina and along the northern coastal road, U.S. troops endured punishing counterattacks yet continued pressing forward, often fighting past exhaustion. German observers reported that American infantry held their ground with surprising tenacity and launched assaults with increasing aggression. Italy reinforced this impression. Battles at Salerno, Monte Cassino, and Anzio showcased a U.S. Army willing to absorb heavy casualties while maintaining offensive pressure. German paratroopers and panzer grenadiers, among the most elite formations in Europe, were surprised by the determination of American troops who refused to disengage even when pinned down. The Americans were no longer the hesitant adversaries of Tunisia. Their fighting spirit had hardened, and their readiness to push forward under fire had begun to unsettle veteran German units. By 1944, as Allied preparations for the invasion of France intensified, German intelligence reports contained repeated warnings. U.S. forces are attacking with increased aggression. Their infantry no longer withdraw under pressure. Enemy fire is heavier and more sustained than anticipated. The Wehrmacht had long prided itself on its ferocity, its willingness to seize the initiative through decisive violence and bold maneuver. But now German commanders faced a troubling reversal. The Americans were matching that ferocity and in some sectors surpassing it. This shift set the stage for what would become one of the defining characteristics of the Western Front. The growing panic among German soldiers who faced an enemy fighting with a fury far beyond early expectations. And to understand how this fury developed, the broader transformation of the U.S. Army must be explored in full. As the American military prepared for the decisive campaigns of 1944, the transformation underway within its ranks accelerated. The U.S. Army, once criticized for its lack of battlefield aggression, had evolved into a force defined not only by industrial might, but by a sharpened fighting spirit that surprised both allies and enemies alike. Key to this transformation was a profound shift in leadership. Figures such as General George S. Patton, General Omar Bradley, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower imposed new standards that reached from the highest strategic levels down to the smallest infantry platoons. Patton, in particular, insisted on relentless offensive action, driving his troops to attack, maneuver, and maintain pressure regardless of terrain or resistance. Bradley emphasized controlled, methodical aggression, attack by design rather than impulse. Eisenhower's role in unifying Allied strategy ensured that American ferocity on the battlefield was matched by strategic coherence. Training programs reflected these demands. Live fire drills grew more intense. Infantry schools emphasized quick assaults, rapid movement, and shock effect. Units practiced fighting in close terrain, urban, mountainous, and forested conditions meant to mimic the environments they would soon face. The lessons from North Africa and Italy were integrated into new manuals distributed across the Army. Soldiers learned not merely to hold ground, but to seize and exploit it. German intelligence units monitoring these developments became increasingly uneasy. Reports intercepted from Sicily and Italy already warned of the rising intensity of American attacks. German officers noted that U.S. troops showed greater willingness to close with the enemy, a stark contrast to earlier months when American forces often paused under fire. By the spring of 1944, this aggression had become systemic. Artillery crews trained to produce overwhelming fire volume in short bursts, saturating German positions before infantry advances. Tank units practiced coordinated assaults that pushed through resistance with momentum rather than caution. Even engineers, often overlooked in narratives of battlefield aggression, developed techniques for clearing obstacles under fire, enabling U.S. forces to maintain rapid forward movement. The approach was simple yet devastating: hit fast, hit hard, and never give the enemy time to recover. This emerging doctrine would be tested on a scale far greater than any previous operation, the Normandy invasion. German commanders defending the Atlantic Wall had not ignored American improvements, but many still believed the ferocity of their own defenses would blunt any assault. They assumed that American troops, even if more capable than before, would struggle to sustain offensive action under the crushing weight of German fortifications. But preparations behind Allied lines told a different story. During months of staging in Britain, American units underwent continuous rehearsals. Assault troops practiced storming fortified positions using live ammunition. Paratroopers drilled for night drops under chaotic conditions. Commanders refined their plans repeatedly, ensuring that every element of the invasion, naval, airborne, armored, and infantry, could adapt rapidly to unforeseen developments. What German intelligence failed to predict was how deeply this preparation instilled a new mindset within American ranks. Soldiers entered the campaign not only with better equipment and training, but with a hardened determination shaped by the lessons of previous battles. They were ready to push forward with a force of will that many German officers still believed they lacked. The opening battles of Normandy would prove how wrong those expectations were. When U.S. troops emerged from the chaos of the beaches and into the brutal hedgerow country, they fought with a ferocity that stunned German defenders. These were not the hesitant soldiers of early 1943. They were experienced, confident, and unafraid to close with the enemy at close range. German frontline units, paratroopers, panzer grenadiers, and infantry battalions began to report incidents that contradicted their long-held assumptions. American forces launched aggressive counterattacks after suffering losses. They fought through ambushes rather than withdrawing. They pressed assaults in terrain designed to favor defenders. For the Germans, this was more than unexpected, it was alarming. The stage was now set for multiple perspectives that reveal why this shift in American ferocity created panic across the German lines. For German soldiers on the Western Front, one of the most unsettling developments of 1944 was the transformation of the American infantrymen. Early assessments had painted U.S. troops as mechanically trained and lacking instinct under fire. But by the time of Normandy, German units faced men whose resolve had been forged through months of brutal fighting in North Africa and Italy. American soldiers came from diverse backgrounds, farmers, factory workers, students, yet they shared an emerging trait the Germans had miscalculated: a deepening commitment to finish the war and return home alive, no matter the cost. This clarity of purpose manifested. The German defensive advantage in the Bocage was formidable, yet U.S. forces countered it through innovation, using demolitions, tank-mounted cutters, and coordinated assaults that left German defenders little time to react. Infantrymen dashed between gaps in the hedgerows, firing and maneuvering with a sharpness that contradicted pre-war German doctrine. German reports from the period frequently mention the violent counter-assaults delivered by U.S. units after enduring initial losses. Instead of retreating, American platoons regrouped and attacked again, often with greater determination. This persistence forced German defenders into a state of constant alert, eroding their stamina and morale. American tactics were no longer cautious. They were dynamic, aggressive, and unrelenting. And behind this new battlefield ferocity stood a powerful driver: how the enemy perceived it. Angle 3. From the enemy's eyes, German perception of American fury. Perhaps the clearest insight into American aggression comes from the German perspective itself. German infantry, paratroopers, and panzergrenadiers, veterans of years of fighting across Europe, began to express something rare in their reports: unease. It was not just that American forces were improving, it was that they were fighting with a fury that German commanders had not expected. Field reports described U.S. infantry as attacking without hesitation, maintaining heavy fire even under duress, and continuing assault operations at times when withdrawal seemed likely. German officers were particularly shocked by American resilience in close combat. They noted that U.S. soldiers were increasingly difficult to dislodge from positions once gained. Even German elite units began to misjudge American capabilities. Positions thought secure fell under sudden, violent American assaults. Counterattacks that once shattered Allied lines now faltered against determined U.S. resistance. German officers accustomed to dictating tempo found themselves reacting instead. This shift in perception contributed directly to German battlefield panic. They were no longer facing the hesitant, inexperienced army of early 1943. They were facing an opponent that fought with speed, violence, and unwavering purpose. And these perceptions were reinforced by deeper structural changes within the American military, shaping the next set of angles. Angle 4. Leadership and Doctrine: the generals who forged American ferocity. The shift in American battlefield aggression did not emerge spontaneously. It was shaped deliberately by commanders who understood that victory in Europe required more than numbers and industry. Generals such as George S. Patton, Omar Bradley, and Terry de la Meza Allen reshaped the culture of the U.S. Army. They demanded swift assaults, relentless pressure, and an offensive mindset that pushed troops to seize the initiative at every opportunity. Patton, famous for his aggressive philosophy, drilled into his soldiers the idea that momentum was survival. He believed firmly that hesitation only strengthened the enemy. Under his leadership, divisions practiced rapid-fire coordination between armor and infantry, turning theoretical doctrine into battlefield instinct. Bradley emphasized disciplined aggression, controlled, deliberate, but unyielding. His troops were trained to strike with precision and maintain pressure even under heavy resistance. German commanders who once mocked American leadership began to take note. They observed that U.S. units no longer paused after initial contact. Even when taken by surprise, American platoons reorganized quickly and pressed forward with renewed force. Leadership encouraged this. NCOs were empowered, junior officers were trusted, and battlefield initiative was rewarded rather than punished. By 1944, this command philosophy had transformed American formations into instruments of continuous pressure, eroding the defensive advantages Germany once relied upon. And behind this leadership shift stood another source of American ferocity: superior firepower and technology. Angle 5. Firepower and technology, the tools behind the fury. For German soldiers on the Western Front, American ferocity was not only expressed in human determination, it came through the sheer volume and coordination of U.S. firepower. The American war machine operated with a level of logistical precision and technological support unmatched by any Axis army. American artillery was a defining factor. Using reliable radios and forward observers, U.S. forces delivered fast, accurate barrages that pinned German units before they could maneuver. German defenders frequently reported being overwhelmed by sustained shelling that arrived within minutes of contact. Unlike German batteries, which often suffered ammunition shortages, American guns rarely went silent. Small arms, too, contributed to this battlefield aggression. The semi-automatic M1 Garand allowed U.S. infantrymen to fire faster than their German counterparts equipped with bolt-action rifles. In close combat, this rate of fire added devastating force to American assaults. Machine guns like the Browning M1919, paired with abundant ammunition, provided suppressive capabilities that kept German heads down during advances. Armor added another layer. Though individually inferior to German Tigers and Panthers, Sherman tanks operated in large, fast-moving groups supported by infantry and artillery. Their reliability and availability gave American units the ability to launch aggressive maneuvers repeatedly, exhausting German defensives over time. To German soldiers, this combination of firepower, speed, and persistence felt like an overwhelming storm, one that seemed to rebuild itself faster than the Germans could respond. Yet firepower alone did not explain everything. There was a deeper psychological element at play. Angle 6. The psychological collapse: why American fury broke German morale. By the summer of 1944, many German units were facing more than battlefield losses. They were confronting a growing sense of inevitability. American aggression, sustained day after day, eroded the morale of even experienced German formations. Soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front described the Americans as surprisingly resilient, capable of pressing attacks under conditions where earlier armies might have faltered. One of the most demoralizing aspects for German troops was the Americans' ability to recover from initial setbacks. A failed assault was often followed by a second, stronger one. A repelled attack in the morning turned into a breakthrough by afternoon. This persistence created a psychological pressure that wore down defenders who expected their enemy to withdraw. American logistical confidence further broke German resolve. Soldiers on the front line knew that U.S. forces would be resupplied with ammunition, food, and reinforcements quickly, creating the impression of an enemy that never tired, never ran out, and never paused its forward push. German accounts frequently mention the unending nature of American assaults. This psychological toll became evident in Normandy's hedgerows, where German defenders realized that American ferocity was no longer the exception, it was the rule. The enemy they faced had transformed into a relentless force driven by leadership, firepower, and a hardened will to advance. And this growing American fury reached its defining moment in the battles that followed, the climax of the campaign, where German panic became undeniable. July 1944, Normandy, France. The sun had barely risen when the hedgerows erupted with the sound of American fire. For weeks, German defenders had relied on the labyrinth of bocage fields to blunt Allied advances. The terrain favored them. Narrow lanes, high earthen walls, and thick vegetation created natural fortresses from which experienced infantry could launch ambushes and disappear before counterfire arrived. The Germans had fought in these fields with confidence, certain the Americans would struggle to break through. But now something had changed. On the morning of July 11, 1944, near the town of Saint-Lô, a German platoon positioned inside a fortified hedgerow heard a new and unsettling rhythm in the American advance. The U.S. troops were moving faster, shouting clear commands, coordinating fire and movement with a precision the Germans had rarely seen before. Machine guns opened in synchronized bursts. Grenades arced over hedgerows in carefully timed volleys. Rifle teams swept the gaps between fields with astonishing speed. The first German assumption that this was a temporary surge collapsed within minutes. American soldiers smashed through hedgerow walls using explosives and tank-mounted cutters. Sherman tanks, which once hesitated at the edges of the dense vegetation, now burst through with steel prongs welded to their hulls. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire, enabling infantry to surge forward behind armored protection. German defenders watching from concealed nests felt the rhythm shift. The Americans weren't testing their lines, they were assaulting them with collapsed. Communication lines disintegrated. Units that once prided themselves on discipline found themselves scattered, stunned, and unable to coordinate. But the true shock came not from the bombing. It came from what followed. American infantry and armored divisions surged forward with a ferocity that stunned German defenders. The U.S. Army, once criticized for slow maneuvering, now advanced with breathtaking speed. Sherman tanks raced through gaps in German lines, supported by infantry whose movements were precise, violent, and relentless. German defenders attempting counterattacks found themselves overwhelmed almost instantly. Reports from the 2nd Panzer Division described American assaults as swift and overpowering, with units pressing forward regardless of losses. This was not the cautious, inexperienced army of early 1943. It was a force driven by momentum, coordination, and an unmistakable will to break through, no matter the resistance. One German officer wrote after the battle, "The Americans attacked as if nothing could stop them." As Cobra expanded, American fury translated into operational collapse for German forces. Panzer groups attempting to reorganize discovered that American armor was already behind them. Infantry positions meant to anchor the line found themselves isolated within hours. German soldiers trying to withdraw along narrow rural roads were struck by relentless artillery fire and strafing aircraft. The speed of the American advance became a source of panic. German commanders could not reposition fast enough to form coherent defensive lines. Their logistical shortages, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, grew catastrophic under the pressure of constant retreat. In contrast, American supply lines kept pace effortlessly, feeding the relentless forward drive. Then came the critical moment, the encirclement at the Falaise Pocket. As American forces swept east and British and Canadian troops pressed from the north, tens of thousands of German soldiers became trapped in a tightening noose near the town of Falaise. The battlefield turned into a desperate, chaotic struggle. German units tried to escape through narrow corridors under constant Allied fire. Those who survived described the experience as hellish, with American artillery and tank fire cutting down retreating columns. Inside the pocket, German morale collapsed. Officers struggled to maintain discipline. Troops flooded roads in disorganized masses, abandoning equipment to flee on foot. What had begun as a controlled withdrawal transformed into a rout. The Americans, fueled by momentum and confidence, advanced with relentless energy. Infantry fired continuously into German defensive pockets. Tanks blocked escape routes with calculated precision. Artillery hammered choke points where German units attempted last-minute breakouts. A German staff officer captured the moment with haunting simplicity. The enemy fights with inexhaustible force, as if driven forward by something we cannot match. By August 21, 1944, the Falaise Pocket collapsed entirely. German losses were catastrophic. Tens of thousands killed, wounded, or captured. Thousands of vehicles abandoned. Entire divisions shattered beyond repair. The remnants of the German army in France fled eastward in disarray, pursued by an American force that showed no sign of slowing. For German soldiers who escaped the destruction, the psychological toll was immense. Many wrote that they had never seen an enemy fight with such violent resolve combined with overwhelming logistical strength. They spoke of American fury, not as a temporary surge, but as a defining characteristic of an army that had grown more dangerous with every battle. The Americans were no longer the inexperienced newcomers of 1943. They were a powerful, aggressive, and unstoppable force, one that had broken the German front wide open. And as the shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht withdrew toward the borders of the Reich, the consequences of this turning point would reshape the remainder of the war. The collapse of German defenses in Normandy left a shockwave that rippled through every level of the Wehrmacht. What had begun as an attempt to contain the Allied landings had transformed into a full-scale disaster. The speed, ferocity, and unbroken momentum of the American advance had shattered any remaining illusions within German command. What they faced now was not a clumsy, inexperienced opponent. It was a force whose aggression seemed to intensify with every mile gained. In the immediate aftermath of Operation Cobra and the fall of the Falaise Pocket, German commanders conducted rushed assessments to understand how the front had collapsed so completely. Again and again, frontline officers reported the same phenomena. American attacks came faster than expected, hit harder than anticipated, and continued long after German forces assumed they would pause. U.S. divisions demonstrated a willingness to press assaults late into the evening, a pattern that exhausted German units already stretched thin. The Wehrmacht's own logistical struggles added to the sense of panic. Fuel shortages immobilized armored units. Ammunition distribution faltered. Vehicle losses mounted at a rate impossible to replace. American logistical superiority, by contrast, seemed limitless. Supply trucks roared forward along dusty French roads, ensuring infantry and armor could maintain constant pressure. German soldiers saw American aggression not merely in their attacks, but in their unstoppable ability to sustain them. As retreating units regrouped in central France, commanders reported alarming drops in morale. Veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front admitted that the American advance possessed a unique combination of intensity and consistency. Soviet assaults had often been overwhelming in manpower, but the Americans brought something different: precision paired with ferocity, and a methodical drive that left German defenders no room to reorganize. Letters and diaries from German soldiers described deepening fear. Some wrote of the Americans' unbreakable momentum, others of their unending fire. Many noted the psychological burden of facing an enemy who attacked again and again, even after suffering losses. Entire companies dissolved not from direct combat, but from the cumulative weight of exhaustion, fear, and the realization that their positions could not hold. Reports reaching Berlin painted an equally grim picture. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, received dispatches warning that American forces were advancing with unprecedented speed, and showing offensive determination beyond previous estimates. Hitler dismissed many of these warnings, convincing the Western Allies lacked the resolve to push deep into France. But frontline commanders knew the truth. The Americans were not slowing. If anything, their fury had increased after breaking free from the hedgerows. This growing panic was not limited to the infantry. Panzer crews, trained to dominate open terrain, found themselves overwhelmed by swarms of American armor, supported by artillery and fighter bombers. Defensive ambushes that once crippled Allied advances now yielded only temporary gains before being erased by counterattacks. German anti-tank teams reported facing relentless waves of Shermans supported by infantry who closed in with speed and aggression. Strategically, the loss of France created a new nightmare for German planners. The Western Front had crumbled far faster than anticipated, exposing the borders of the Reich itself. As American mechanized columns swept toward Belgium and the Netherlands, the question haunting German high command was no longer whether they could stop them. It was whether they could slow them. The reality was becoming clear. American fury on the battlefield had turned into a strategic storm, reshaping the course of the war in Western Europe. And as the Allies neared Germany's borders, this shift would lead to even more profound consequences. Consequences that would define the final year of the conflict. As the German army retreated toward the borders of the Reich, the consequences of the American breakout became painfully clear. Entire formations that had once anchored the Western Front were now reduced to fragments. Battalions compressed into companies, companies into exhausted clusters of survivors. The ferocity with which American troops had fought in Normandy carried forward across France, accelerating the collapse of German defensive cohesion. By early September 1944, American mechanized forces were advancing at a pace few German commanders believed possible. Towns that had expected days of resistance fell within hours. German strongpoints, hastily reconstructed during the retreat, were often overwhelmed before reinforcements arrived. The Americans attacked with a relentless urgency, pushing deeper into territories the German army had occupied for years. Their fury, once localized in hedgerow battles, now shaped entire operational movements. One German officer wrote after the battle, "The American forces showed no hesitation in assaulting well-prepared positions. Even after encountering mines